Well, how about we just go ahead and get started then?
I'm ready when you are.
People can keep trickling in. But we're really happy to have Bill Chedister with us here today, who's the Fort Wainwright Energy Manager, but has a lot of experience in energy engineering for many years. So I'm glad you're here with us now and excited to hear from your experience.
Thank you. All right.
Okay, now it's all yours.
Okay, very good. Well, what I'm going to talk about this morning is energy management more from the behavioral side. And from the behavioral side, it's really a matter of trying to get people to do what they know they should be doing. But it's a lot different than what you see in the big investments. It really is not a big cost investment, but there are a lot of pitfalls that are involved with when you try to address the behavioral side of energy management. That's what I'm going to talk about. Largely, this builds on my experience coming to Fort Wainwright. I spent a number of years in energy management before I came up here in 2014. And interestingly enough, a lot of the things that I did in previous energy-related jobs come to play up here quite a bit. My first job actually in energy had to do with a General Motors operation back in the late 70s. And interestingly enough, they did, at that point, what we're really still trying to do up here now is that we're taking the energy usage information and putting it on the responsibility of the building owners, or building operators. And basically, at that time, the operation I worked at had 16 different plants, manufacturing, offices, and warehouses, and so forth. What we did, and then what we were the energy management section in the plant engineering division. And what we did was actually put meters in all the different buildings, and the idea was to give the building operators and building managers a budget to work with, just like they had a financial budget. We said, okay, given your weather conditions, given your production levels, and the other different factors, this is how much energy you should use. And in that case, the energy was a combination of natural gas, steam, electricity, compressed air, and water. So really, the focus of what I've been involved with here and other stops along the way is pretty much the same. It's been getting people just to be aware of, and I think of it as simply as what's the one piece of paper that really makes people save energy? Well, it's the bill you get. Yeah, so that's the accountability and so forth that really makes people pay attention. But sometimes actually getting to that point is a little more complicated than what you might think right off the top. So that's what we're talking about today. So as we go through this, if you have any questions, just let me know. Okay. So one particular point in my employment history is particularly significant in the way I look at things today. I spent a good number of years with a company that went all over the country, basically, and worked with K-12 school districts, higher education facilities, and some of these mega churches around the country, and basically worked with them to establish, the energy awareness and the accountability within their organizations to address energy issues. And we had basically, when you talk about behavioral elements, I've got 4 points up on the board that really are associated with behavior: authority, responsibility, accountability, and inconsistency. So again, these are not really hard and fast financial terms like you usually think of and associated with energy management, but these are the plans or the aspects that have to be in place for a behavioral energy program to work. Authority, a lot of these some of these definitions come from papers, and the papers that I base this presentation on are available at the end for anyone who would be interested. But authority, somebody's got to be in charge. Without the authority behind the program, it's just not going to work. It must be clearly defined. In the aspect of the school districts, it was really pretty easy because you had the superintendent was responsible for bringing the program into the district. And of course, that person has authority over the principals, who in turn have authority over the teachers. So there's a pretty clear chain of authority. So that's what really was critical to making the program work. Responsibility, you have to, all along the way, throughout the organization, you have to make it clear who's responsible for doing what. And you can say it's communication, but it does imply accountability. Accountability means that if you're given a responsibility, you need to carry it through. You need to see it through. And if you don't, there's going to be consequences. And if you do, hopefully there'll be some sort of incentive. And we'll talk more about both of those punishments and incentives, because they are key to holding people accountable. Inconsistency is a problem when in behavioral energy programs. If you're inconsistent in any aspect of the communication chain, it's a loss of credibility, trust, and respect. Brings in inefficiency, and as I'll touch on later, it's probably better if you have a program that stops and starts and starts and stops and starts and stops. People lose faith in it. They don't say, well, why should we bother? It's probably going to fail anyway. You've got an inefficiency, and that, again, loss of credibility and trust in the program. So as I tell people, sometimes it's better not to start these programs than to start and stop.
Sounds like our recycling efforts here over the decades.
Yeah, it's a good example. I'm not critical of that program, but, again, people have a tendency to take it for granted that, well, why should I really do this? And so all these, you can see how all these factors come into play. So one thing, my background's in engineering, and everything starts with data. You can't control what you can't measure, and that's just a tried and true adage of engineering. If you can't measure it, and you can see how, and when you talk about accountability, go back to this as simple as your bill at home. If you didn't get your bill at home, if it wasn't based on what you used, how much attention are you really going to pay to it? So again, you have to meter, you have to decide what you're going to track, you have to track it, and then you have to bring that information forward. And then that's again, you're hearing this from an engineer, but I live in numbers a lot, maybe more than I should sometimes, but without that part, you just don't have that substantiation behind your program. So what is it that you want to get people to do? What is it you want your program to do? First step is defining what can be controlled. I mean, again, over at the installation, you have people are always changing. Occupancy of buildings is always changing. The purposes of buildings can be changing too sometimes. What can you control? What we want to look at is don't use what you don't need. Turn off the unused appliances, the lighting. When you get to space temperature, you have occupied and unoccupied. Again, this has been interesting for me coming up to the Alaska interior from the lower 48. You have, basically all the places that I went. It was pretty clear when you're occupied and unoccupied, setting your times and your schedules and your conditions and so forth for fresh air and temperature. Up here, of course, you don't set buildings back in the wintertime because many times you can't bring them back up to temperature when it's time for them to be occupied. So that's just one of the nuances of being in the Alaska interior, which you're probably more familiar with all that than I am. But the other thing in space temperature, what do you run into? If you have a building that used to hold a lot of people, not only has a few people, what are you going to do? Do you keep the whole building space up to temperature, or do you go for some sort of local space heaters and so forth? And then, of course, the human element, people want to be comfortable. Well, define comfort. And when we define comfort, we go by the ASHRAE recommendations, which are, specific temperature range and fresh air range and so forth. So, again, what can be controlled, lights and appliances and so forth, that can be space temperature. We want to keep on top of that one. We don't want people to be too hot or too cold. But probably what's more important there is the next point, the fourth point there is the report space conditions. Again, a lot of this is what this is about is energy awareness. We want people to be aware of their environment. And actually, the way it's evolved with my program that I'm working on at Fort Wainwright, we want people to report what's not working right. If we can do that, then realistically, that's going to cover more ground for us financially than worrying about specific temperatures, whether they're a degree too warm or a degree too cool in the winter time and so forth. What else do we want people to do? We want people to report the building envelope conditions, and this is probably one of the main things that we do get an economic return on in the housing and even in our buildings. We want to know if you're overheating in an area or your windows are not right, or your doors are not right, or so forth. There's a potential for damage, and that's one of the main things we run into is the space that's overheating. So what do people do? They open the windows. So what happens then? They leave the room with the windows open, and it gets to a point where pipes are frozen, and then you do have a serious economic event that you have to deal with. So, but what's the point of the program? Get people to know what they're supposed to be doing and make sure they do it.
I have a question about when you're saying the unoccupied versus occupied. Is a lot of that in interior versus other places? Is that a lot of that you think climate driven, or is it maybe our buildings have more of our buildings just not been updated for those sort of controls? I don't know.
Yeah, it's when you get to the unoccupied conditions, you look at how much can you set it back, how much can you let the temperatures drop down, and again, it is a matter of the controls and the efficiency within the building. There's several factors. Is your ventilation system capable of bringing the building back up in a reasonable time? In the past, I've worked on buildings actually in the lower 48 where it was actually more economical to just keep them up 24 hours, because of the cost of trying to bring them back up.
Okay.
It was just not worth it. So it does depend on the building. Yeah, the controls, how much heat is it losing, what's the envelope condition of the building. So and people will let you know when they come in on Monday or any other morning. If it's not ready, they're going to let you know. So the building is what it is. I mean, you deal with what you've got. And what I tell people, we've got at Fort Wainwright a very competent design branch, and they have a lot of standards to work to and so forth. So they meet their standards, and they set the parameters. And I look at it as saying, what's the most efficient way to meet what you have to meet? You tell us what you need, and then we'll do it. I mean, we would love to say, oh yeah, drop it down to 55, and that, but if it's not going to work, it's not worth pushing it. So we get back to how do we manage behavior? There's incentives, punishment, the power of suggestion, and feedback. Incentives. Actually, it's kind of interesting in doing some of the background for the presentation because I got to read a couple interesting articles about how the brain works, and it really does get to be quite involved. But a lot of the neuroscience suggests that when it comes to motivating action, rewards are more effective than punishments because people seem to look at positive information as being more meaningful than negative information. They look at negative information and say, well, that doesn't apply to me, or it's not my fault, or maybe there's going to be some excuse to kind of kind of discredit the negative information. But when they get positive information, it gives them a much more optimistic outlook. And it actually, positive information that, triggers a reward signal in the brain. So some of it is more than just than lip service or what you might see on the superficial level. There are things that do happen in the brain, how the brain responds to positive feedback compared to negative feedback. So the positive feedback, one thing, it's actually both of these kind of build on themselves. The negative feedback is a disincentive for trying to improve behavior in a number of cases, where the positive feedback itself it feeds on itself in a more positive direction, or in a good direction, making more likely to be repeated. So that's the brain side. The caution about incentives is they can get more complicated than what you might think. They have to be credible. The incentive has to be meaningful to the party or that you're trying to influence and is the outcome that you want. They can lose effect over time. Again, I did a lot of work with Energy Star, and the first year, a building won an Energy Star award. All the people were excited. They'd have have an assembly, and they get the plaque on the wall and so forth. And the second year it was, well, it's great, we got it 2 years in a row. And then third year, fourth year, it's like, well, we already did this. Why? This isn't such a big deal anymore. So they can lose their effect over time. You can understand how things are just kind of taken for granted, really. And then there's the other thing too is that the last point, if the energy cost increases can offset conservation efforts, you can actually be more effective with your energy usage and end up with a bigger bill. And that's one of the problems, like with cash incentives, is that, again, people get used to getting cash for an incentive or something like that. When we look at energy usage, we look at the consumption and actual usage first, and we don't look at the cost. We can calculate the cost of the energy savings and so forth, but you can actually, again, if you're working on a budget, you can actually run over your energy budget cash-wise, monetarily, and still be more effective with your energy usage. So it gets to be a little complicated, and believe me, we had a hard time explaining this to people, but it is reality. There's a issue called cost avoidance, which you may or may not be familiar with, and you can have positive cost avoidance but spend more money. So cost avoidance is not cash. It's how much more would you have spent if you did not put these measures in place. So it gets, sometimes people are like looking for a nice cash incentive for doing all this work. They say, well, wait a minute, how can we lose money but still, how can the cost avoidance be so positive but we're still paying more money? And again, you go back to when it's the behavior standpoint, that attitude, that you don't have the credibility in your incentives and so forth, and in what you're doing, it can be very detrimental to the program. Cash versus avoided cost. Are you familiar with cost? I know Ben is. But if you're familiar with Energy Star programs, it's much the same. In fact, even over with the government institutions, we have a base year established. It was 2003, and then with an executive order under the Obama administration, that one ran out. We went to a base year of 2015. But what you do is you acquire all your information, your energy usage information for that year, and then you look at the current year compared to that base year. And what you do is you compare, was the weather colder in the wintertime? Was it hotter in the summertime? What other factors? If you look at specific buildings, is the building occupied now where it wasn't occupied, or vice versa? Is it not occupied where it was occupied, and so forth? These are all adjustments. And what you do then is you compare your current year to your base year, if your base year had the same factors as your current year, and that's how you draw your comparison. And again, we look at it always at energy usage first, and then you apply whatever the current rate is, dollar-wise. So where I did work was great when utility rates were going up, because a small increase or a decrease in energy usage, when the rates are increasing, makes for a big cost avoidance. However, on the other hand, we ran into it on our customers using natural gas when they maybe made a reduction in their gas usage, but the price literally fell in half from like over 40 cents a therm to 20 cents a therm, well, from $1 down to about 50 cents a therm. They lost the incentive, and our contracts were actually based on their cost avoidance, so we had to refigure our contracts quite a bit.
When you're looking at weather, you're talking about heating degree days?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. Yeah, and that's interesting up here, because I don't deal with any air conditioning up here. It's all heating degree days, and so that's exactly right. So, as touched on before, punishments are more effective for trying to deter people from acting in an undesirable manner. But when we anticipate something bad, our brain triggers a no-go signal, and what they do is like freeze action, makes you not want to go there. Or again, what we ran into before, or what we spoke of before, is that the punishment, instead of many times seeing as an actual incentive, so to speak, to not repeat a undesirable action, a lot of times the reaction is, that wasn't my fault. We try to avoid that. Feeling. And then mentioned earlier the power of suggestion. So as I always say, there's thermostats, there's humidistats, and there's placebo-stats. And I always have a favorite story of the last item, the placebo-stat. I worked in an area where they had a lot of heat treat furnaces. We were actually able to capture the heat off of those furnaces and turn that back into heating the space during the wintertime. But in the process of doing that, we turned off a lot of the local heaters. This was at that time was a division, General Motors, that had a very active union, and anything that changed the environment and brought a lot of concern in a hurry. So when we started turning the heaters off, even though our heat exchanger was bringing more heat into the area than really all the heaters combined, a lot of the workers saw the heaters being turned off and said, "Oh, this is a grievance. We're going to we're going to fight this action." So what had happened when we put in the heat exchanger, we put the control up on the wall, we put the thermostat up on the wall, and went to the electrical foreman and said, "Please wire this in." And he said, "No, I'm not going to wire this in." And we went through the whole situation with the heat exchanger providing all the more heat than the space actually even needed. Electrical foreman said yes, he understood that, but he anticipated the behavior was going to happen with the workforce. So we put the heater in, or put the heat exchanger in, turned off all the other heaters. When the complaints came in, the foreman went over to the head union representative for that area and said, "Well, if you don't feel like you're getting enough heat, why don't you go over and turn up the thermostat?" The thermostat, which of course was not connected to anything. So the person went over and turned up the thermostat and said, "Yes, I feel much better now," and everybody was happy. So again, the power of suggestion is what and it's not uncommon for controls in a lot of places not to be hooked up to anything, because if people what else did we run into? We run into wet gloves on top of thermostats in the wintertime. As the glove dried out, it got the thermostat cold, so the thermostat would catch in more heat and so forth. So there's a lot of abuse with controls. So sometimes the power of suggestion is a very powerful tool.
So I was thinking you'd call Alexa, turn up the heat. That's the modern day version.
Yeah. Right, right. Well,
I
if you
can't.
think people, if you tell them they're being warmer, sometimes they'll catch on. So now we're starting to get into what I spend more time doing is the benchmarking. Benchmarking is much like setting the base year of what we had before. It's a lot of data collection, and it's a challenge sometimes. I know one of the challenges we face over at the base is just getting reliable metering. We try to put, as you're aware, we've got the central plant that provides steam to the buildings, but measuring steam is always poses a lot of technical difficulties, and so it's when Fort Wainwright did get into a major metering program back in 2008, 2009 or so, they decided to put steam meters in on the buildings, and steam meters, they're hard to calibrate, and another problem with them is that up here, of course, you're going from a very high load in the winter to like zero load in the summer. So where I had worked in the past, I had installed steam meters, but it was in the Midwest in an industrial situation where there was a steam load all year round. It was higher in the winter, but it could fit the meter to the range very well. Here, it's very difficult to fit a steam meter to the zero to what you need to keep a building warm when it's 40 below outside. But beyond that, again, what benchmarking does, it gives you a baseline. I mean, again, how can you tell if you're doing better or if you're ahead or behind? And again, I go back to saying, an engineer, I live in a lot of numbers, and you just have to have some substantiation behind what you're doing. So it tells an organization how it is doing. You can use that information. How can it be more effective in the future? You can use that information for planning. It gives you, again, objective findings that will allow you to define your good practices versus identifying practices that need to be changed. In different areas, you can prioritize your areas of operation. You always hear about demand. Of course, Fort Wainwright has a lot of nuances. We don't have demand like a regular building would have a demand because we generate our own power. Everything is just how much we use, not how much we use at one time, which is what demand is. If you have demand issues in your building, then you try to focus maybe your if there's operations that you can move to overnight instead of during the day, or second shift instead of first shift when the demand rates are lower. But that's what we mean by prioritizing the areas of operations. Again, even having that information, just being able to put it out to people and say this is what you're doing, giving them and as a feedback and so forth, the managers and even the people on the floor and occupants of the building, seeing that data firsthand a lot of times just involves them, does some empowering, say, hey, we can do this or we can do that. Let them be involved with it. You need, again, from my standpoint, you need data to be able to do that. So when you put all this together, how much difference can it make? And typically, like in school buildings, when we started a program, each building is different, each district is different, they have different issues and different costs and so forth. We would typically see a 10 to 20% increase or a 10 to 20% improvement in actual energy expenditures. And we'd see going from no information to getting information and holding, establishing the authority and accountability. That was our typical PAR and so forth. So, and we were very tough on people. I mean, we told them what we saw, what we expected them to do, and we held them to it. Again, we had that authority in some of the school districts. Not quite that way at Fort Wainwright, and I mean, the way I personally look at it, we're dealing with soldiers. Their purpose is to be soldiers there, and if we see them not turning their lights off or not doing what some of the things we would expect them to do. We want to make sure they know about it, but we can't have a hard time going back and shaking my fingers at someone who's trained to do what they're trying to do and what they'll be doing. So, but in this case, I use this as an example. There was and this was a residential example here, where two groups. One group was given tailored information, which means information about energy saving measures, that were relevant to them, and given their feedback and their usage, and they saved about 5%, a little over 5% of the energy, whereas the people who were just left to on their own actually used a little bit more energy over the same period of time. But what was interesting, what came out of this study, was that they found that where they did apply information and gave feedback back to the building occupants and so forth, they had more success. The more difficult the goal was, the more effective they were. If a group was trying to save 10% or 20%, it was much more effective than the group that was was trying to save like 5%. And that numbers in that particular study kind of backed it up, but in general, that was one of the conclusions that they did reach, that the more difficult the goal, as long as you're providing the feedback, is going to give a greater sense of accomplishment to the occupants of the building, to the people involved in the study. And the feedback, again, I go back to the data, the substantiation, letting people know, how did they perform? Are they doing better? What are the, and getting the occupants involved. You can overdo it, but it is more effective when given frequently. So I've kind of touched on all this before. What I've put in place at Fort Wainwright, and it's still a work in progress, but came up with put a building rating system in place. Now, again, when you start the program, you got to prioritize the issues. The most important issue is the mission, and then comfort, and then efficiency. And we kind of touched on this before, is that if you even look at it on a building level, a building has a mission. A hangar has a purpose. An office building has a purpose. And it's hard to compare different types of buildings to each other. In fact, even at Fort Wainwright, we've got newer hangars and older hangars. How do you compare a new performance of a new hangar to an older hangar? And I don't think you really can. So I always say you can only compare a building to itself. But again, a hangar is going to use more power, more energy than an office building, just because if you open up a door when it's cold outside, it takes a lot of energy to heat it back up again. Comfort, we just go back to standards. If you went around and asked people what makes you comfortable, you're asking for a can of worms, because that's going to vary very much on who you talk to and where they work and their age and body types and so forth. So ASHRAE has a set of standards for comfort. They call it the 80% rule. It's like for any group, you're going to have 10% are not going to be happy no matter what you do. 10% are going to be happy no matter what you do. It's the 80% in the middle that you try to take care of. And then when all that's done and all that's established, then you look at efficiency. Once you know what the space is about or the building is about and what the comfort level has to be, then what equipment have you got? How can you get there with the best use of energy and your resources with what you've got? Again, when we're talking about behavioral things, you can always improve building envelopes. You can always put on better windows and a better roof and improve HVAC equipment and so forth. That costs money, and we have to look at that budgeting. What you're going to get for that budgeting amount compared to what else can those dollars be used for? And sometimes the dollars are hard to come by. So, so we just look at what can we control with behavior. My particular study applies only electricity just because that's the only thing we've got we can measure. And to be honest, sometimes I'm not sure we're particularly accurate in measuring what we've got for electricity, but that's another story. So.
You know, a question in Fort Wainwright's case, though, electricity, is that not a byproduct of providing steam during the wintertime?
Well, that's a good point, and that's an issue that goes back and forth. We do have the plant that, of course, it's old, and it's one of the issues we're really working through right now is what's going to happen to that plant. It is the oldest coal-fired plant in the country, but it is a cogeneration plant because to operate that plant most efficiently is that we do operate by steam load. Not that we always do it, but I mean that is the way to best operate that plant, and especially right now. In the years past, even since I've been here, at one point it was more economical for us to generate a lot more electricity to maximize everything, and we were actually sending power down to Fort Greeley. And what has happened is the price of coal went up and the price of electricity from GVA went down, so the situation is entirely reversed. So now it is, we're in a situation right now where basically, it sounds almost backwards, but the less we operate the plant, the more efficient it becomes. But it's actually, we're decreasing inefficiency of site versus source energy. Because again, when we're running a plant, we're looking at source energy and you have the inefficiency of all the losses of burning coal. So when it comes to electricity, when we buy electricity from GVA, the inefficiency is on their part. They're the ones doing the generation. All we have to do is use the electricity. So, but to answer your question, if our plant is most efficient when it's operated to provide the steam load we need and then bringing the other electricity from the side. So but we do, it does generate inherently some extra steam that we do for power. So, as I said, we started with the base, start with collecting the data, and compare two things. I'm just going to skip ahead here. We look at the energy usage on a year-to-year basis, and we also look at the energy usage on a month-to-month basis. And so when I say a month-to-month basis, we compare, for instance, in this case, January of 18 to January of 17. When I put together this slide, we had the data through January. So the last 12 months period would have been the 12 months ending in January of 18 versus the 12 months ending in January 17, and the current month is January of 18 versus January of 17. So what we do is we look at the buildings and give them a score, kind of like golf or cross country. The building that had the greatest reduction in the current month gets a 1, and this next best building gets a 2, and so forth. The building that had the best performance year to year also gets a 1, and so forth down the line. So then I add up the score of the current month and the 12th month, and whoever, as you go across to the final column there, you can see on the overall, like building 3499 was the best in the 12 months and the best in the month to month. So, makes it look, makes it look simple, right? Not so fast, because if you look at building 3499 compared to another building, any other building, it was unoccupied. So we have to take into account that I'm not sure what building 3499 is used for right offhand, but it's not so much that it's a smaller building; it's that it used less energy overall, even when it was occupied. But when you look at this rating system, you have to take into account what's been going on in that building. And so when you talk about incentives or disincentives and so forth, you got to look at reality here. So, but by the same token, I use that same system and rate the buildings in the opposite direction. I say, what's the worst building from month to month, and what's the worst building over the last year? And then what we do then is we go back and look at that building and again, we have it set up so it can pull out a chart that compares month to month what happened in one building. And it's what's interesting is on 2132 on the right-hand side, it looked like it was a lot worse. It looked like it was it looks like the energy information or the energy usage in that particular building on the month-to-month basis more than doubled. It went up almost 130%. Well, they had a meter error, is what it was. But again, the way this works for me at Fort Wainwright, it's based on data where I don't really feel that we can, have some reservations about going forward with any sort of incentive program until I really get, the higher level backing behind it. In the meantime, myself and some of the people I work with will look at this information, and we've got to go out and audit buildings. So we're going to look at a building 2132 and say, what in the world is going on over there? And that allows us to focus our efforts on what we don't know what's going on. We just know the power usage went way up. So then again, we'll go over there, and it turns out that they had a heating failure in one area of the building. They put in a bunch of electric heaters, and so it really jacked up their electric usage. So what do we have to do? We had to go in and find out what the issue was, and then make sure that the area of that heating was fixed. So again, this is a tool for not only incentives, but also more to the point for us right now, is where do we focus on our efforts in trying to, improve building operation, data-based. So, what else is new that I'm putting in? When we've had some problems with our metering systems, actually collecting the data over the last few months. But when we do get that worked out, this is another example of what you can do on a year-to-year comparison. In this case, we're looking at 15-minute data, and which is if you're familiar with electrical billing, that's how your demand charges are based on your peak usage for a 15-minute period. But we can use that information again. In this case, this is one of our buildings that had some work done on it. This was the month of, I believe, January. In January of 18, which is the current usage in red, and then January 2017 in black. And it's pretty obvious what was going on. You can see in that month, of course, the first week was short because of the Year's Day holiday, but the second week in black, you see very clearly five very clearly defined days. This is a warehouse, and basically it's lighting load in this case, and some ventilation work also. But what happened, they made some major renovations in that building. And so when we looked at this particular section of the building, you can see that in the first few weekends, instead of having a shutdown over the weekend, again, with this lighting and maybe some ventilation load, they let things run over the weekend. So this is the type of thing we're looking for our energy efficiency, is that when you find things that are on that don't need to be on, correct them. And so this tells us, oh, hey, we had some problems here, and it was a lighting schedule issue. So they fixed the lighting schedule, and you can see by the end of that month. But again, the point is, we've got a substantial reason to go in and find out, what the issues are, and make that building operate more efficiently. So again, not being too redundant here, what issues can be identified, what can be controlled, how do you substantiate what is really happening? Any building, you can't compare, one building to another in most cases. You can only compare a building against itself. But in terms of the, behavioral aspect, then, what I found is starting and stopping a program is worse than not starting in the first place. If you're going to use incentives, make them meaningful, make sure they, are something that can be refreshed and renewed, and you can spend more on incentives than the money you save sometimes. So it's not as there's a little bit more to it than what it looks like. So with that, that's basically the remarks I have prepared. I don't know if there's any questions, or everybody's still awake. That's good. So
I'm curious about the incentive program. So I heard the award that they put on the wall. If a building, for example, on Fort Wainwright meets a benchmark or is number one on the rating system, is another incentive program, they get $50 more in their paycheck, or how does that work as far as incentives that are fruitful and that people appreciate? Is it paycheck related?
I'd say I wouldn't put it a paycheck. I think with the soldiers, I think it's a recognition type thing. Actually, we're going through we touched before on recycling. The current garrison commander has come from installations where recycling was a big deal, and he wanted to get something going here. We've looked at recycling, and it's just to have a full-blown recycling program is not cost effective for us. I mean, we looked at it very seriously a number of times. But what the commander is doing is that there is like a flag, for the units. They can have sort of an attaboy in front of the installation. It's not a cash thing, but it is a recognition, and it might be a day off or something like that, or a day away from training, which makes sense to them, and again that's something that the soldiers appreciate. So and then again, cash is it's not really used very much as an incentive unless you can really substantiate it. The thing is with cash, again, you can run into you can lose the incentive depending. There's so many things you can't control, and it's like I mentioned, like a lot of when it comes to energy and buildings, is that how do you compare someone who's got a modern building with good controls to an old building that's falling apart and leaky windows and so forth like that? I mean, you need an incentive program that puts people on a fairly common ground, and so the recognition is something that even with what we've got here, we can see that you can, when you look at it year to year, it takes time, but you can see where efforts are being made. But some of the efforts that are made depend on projects that are being planned. I mean, we've got a lot of buildings that are going to be renovated over the next few years, and trying to tie that into like any sort of cash incentive, it's it gets really. It sounds simple, but it really does get complicated. But again, make the incentive meaningful to the people who are in the building. In this case, it's the soldiers, and they like the recognition and so forth. They, one likes a little bit better than the next. So that's how it works there. Go ahead.
So if belief drives behavior, like I mean, you mentioned that you had tailored information for some of the buildings. So
yeah.
They could, how do you get people on board believing that conservation is important?
Again, I go back to data. I mean, it's like take into account if it's heat. Take into account, is it warmer this winter than last winter? If it's a colder winter, you could use more heat, but it could still actually be ahead. So
so you don't have to get the soldiers on board through some type of marketing campaign, or
no, I don't think so.
Like
they respond to commands from above, and so we can show costs. And it's not just the energy thing; it's like in the housing and so forth. There's you have a full range. You have people who are going to do it because they know it's right, and they're going to be very conscientious. You're going to have people who couldn't care less, and no matter what you do. So how do you get them on board? It's just in this case, you have a command structure, and you have to work through that.
Does that work like in a union setting?
In my experience, no. In my experience, no. It's my experience with unions was in years past with United Auto Workers, and it was in times when production was key, and so it's like if there was anything that was going to interfere with production, then you're probably not going to get much traction with it. And if you had a workforce that was going to get up, you try to impose some sort of discipline or measure that they didn't really care for, their inclination was to fight it. And if they're fighting it, that's non-productive time. And so if you're going to go into non-productive time, well, you better get ready for a battle.
Yeah.
So, again, that's years past. I can't really speak to, the union issues today. But like I say, we had some pretty colorful things happen. So, it goes down to when you get to the money, you just obviously the managers are looking at it, but I can only, in my position, I can only look at it in terms of are we operating the buildings efficiently as we can, and look at it as a technical issue. And we would like to have people on board, but it's a challenge.
Yeah.
A couple of things. One, I was thinking the university had a kind of a competition with several buildings, and they basically had a method of making it very visible what the electrical use was. Yep. in a particular building, and the one that got the most reduction was the one that got the recognition. And I don't know if that's been tried, but
yeah, you go back to I've seen dashboards and so forth like that, and personally, I'm not crazy about dashboards, just because again, everything here, you see that the data that I've used always takes it back to that building in past, how it performed in the past.
Right.
You'd see it in programs like that. In some buildings, if they weren't maintained properly, now they're maintained well, yeah, they're going to have a big reduction. And sometimes it's not so much of a factor of the people who are occupying those buildings. It's I guess indirectly it could be because maybe they finally said, hey, get this thing fixed, and went to the maintenance department. And then, of course, the maintenance department has to prioritize what can they do, what resources they have. So,
well, the university is pretty equal because they really had very little money to maintain.
Yeah.
They just haven't been well funded for deferred maintenance.
Yeah.
The other thing is that some of the electric utilities, particularly the cooperatives, have looked at a peak notification. So if they're in a situation where they need to really ramp up their energy production for some reason, they were able to. In one case, I think Delaware Electric used a little thing you just plug in the wall, and a little light would come on. So it's basically saying, "Please conserve while that red light is on." And I don't know if that's. They actually found that where they had also time of use rates.
Yes.
And they found that the little red light was as effective as the time of use rates in reducing demand during peak usage times.
Sure.
So I don't know if that fits into any of your scenarios or not, but it's an idea.
If we had, again, we're just in a situation where, if we were buying all our power from GVA, that would make sense.
Yeah.
But we don't, so we don't really have a demand rate, per se.
Right.
Throughout our, we do have somewhat of a demand if we have a power plant problem, or we have generators that are malfunctioning or blow up or something like that. There's situations where we have to buy more power from GVEA. Of course, that affects, I can understand, especially in a where you have a limited area like Fairbanks, where you only have so much load. We hit a ratchet, and what will happen is, okay, up to 5 megawatts, we'll pay one rate, but if we start going over that, then that rate goes up quite a bit. And what happens then with the ratchet is that you pay that higher rate per kilowatt over the next 12 months. So no matter how much you use and so forth. But there are, I think one thing that is very effective for when it can be implemented is that a utility would have a program where an organization like maybe, the University by its own, but say a company or a building and so forth can allow itself to be interrupted, and they'll get a a lower rate all year round in exchange for saying, okay, if we have a power problem, or if in this case, utility company would have a power problem and say, we'll give you a better rate, but you're going to be one of the first ones that we're going to cut off if we have some limited resources. Or
Fort Knox is in that situation.
Yeah. So, and that's been an effective program for a lot of companies and organizations across the country.
Any other questions? Thank you, Bill.
You're welcome.
Hello?
Oh, wait. Is that Nicole?
Oh, I'm sorry. Nicole Stewart here with PetroStar. Sir, did I hear you say earlier that this is the oldest coal plant in the nation?
It is.
Wow. It is. Okay. I thought that was that's okay. That's amazing. I thought maybe you meant to say Alaska, but really in the nation. Wow. Okay. Thank you.
Yeah. When I came up in 2014, I think it was the 10th, and it's gradually been working its way up, and now we're number 1.
And what was it? When was it first built?
Gosh, 50s,
okay.
40s, 50s.
Yeah.
50s, I believe. And steam tunnels, it's old.
Is there some credible plans to replace it with something?
That is, it's a big challenge right now, and it's very interesting because I think the Army's been making a lot of publicity. Right. When I came up here, everything was efficiency. What can we do to be more efficient? What can we do to be more efficient? The atmosphere has changed a little bit. It's what can we do to make sure we're resilient. And as everybody knows, if we lost that power plant, we're in trouble. And so that's bringing a lot more attention to what's going to be the future of the power plant. There's a lot of dynamics going on right now. Are we going to get natural gas? And then there's environmental concerns. Can we be burning gas in the future instead of coal? What's it going to cost to do that? What's it cost to put that infrastructure in place? And these are very expensive, very complicated decisions. So is there a clear plan? I would say no, not at this time, but it is certainly getting a lot of attention.
Yeah, I'm just thinking because I'm on the Golden Valley Board, and one of the things we're wrestling with is what we do with our 1964 coal plant. So we may beat you to it, but
yeah,
that's like
I wouldn't be surprised.
That's like a 2024 to a timeout sort of thing. But yeah, 1950s. That's definitely gets up there. And will we have natural gas? A big pipe by 2025.
Yeah.
That's something FEDC works hard on.
Yeah, the plant isn't getting any younger,
yep.
And neither is our distribution system.
Yeah.
So, we always appreciate the update.
Okay.
Good to
You guys do cooperate with Eielson to some degree, but are they pretty much now independent?
They're pretty much independent. I mean, they do have the coal burning facilities over there. I know they've gone through some upgrades, but we're cognizant of what they're doing. In fact, a number of people in our department have come over for Eielson, so there's a lot of connections between the two. So, but we're Army and their Air Force, and so
I think power used to go back and forth on Golden Valley lines, and that's not happening as much. Just using our transmission
to Eielson,
between Eielson and Fort Wainwright.
Oh, I don't. Since I've been here, I know we were sending power over to Greeley, but how it actually got there, I know went through the TVA lines. But again, right now that's changed just because of the economics.
Yeah. A lot of moving parts to make it all work.
Right. It's interesting. I mean, it's a tough challenge. A lot of, like I say, a lot of moving parts. There's a lot of environmental considerations. There's financial considerations, and like I say, in the meantime, clock is ticking. So.
Yeah. So next week we do have Glenn Hildman with the Alaska Center ICE. That's their new innovation and commercialization facility over there, who will be presenting. Same time, same place. And then we won't have a program the week of Memorial Day, but we will have Audra Braze with the Department of Fish and Game coming to talk about Title 16 and the current process for if you want to permit a project. Think if you're following the Stand for Salmon or the Stand for Alaska initiatives, this is talking about the current process we have in Alaska. So that'll be the first week in June. So hope to see you then.
Thank you.
Have a good week.
Bye, Nicole.
Hi, Nicole.
My
So I'm glad
husband,
you spoke up.
Bye, thank you.
great,
Okay, thank you.
Oh, really?
yeah.
All right. Oskiwawa. Yeah. It's funny how many people I run into from